No music, no narration, just the sound of a dealership showroom in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, the distant clank of the service bay, a phone ringing twice and stopping, the low hum of fluorescent lights over a floor clean enough to reflect the machines sitting on it. Then the sound of a man's boots crossing that floor with the particular pace of someone who has decided what he wants and has come to get it without much interest in the process. His name was Harlan Cross. He was 51 years old, farmed 760 acres in a county that had watched him do it for 23 years, and on that Tuesday afternoon in March, he walked into the Massey Ferguson dealership on the west edge of town and told the dealer a lie. Not a dramatic lie. Not the kind of lie that requires construction and maintenance and the ongoing effort of keeping one version of reality from colliding with another. A small lie, delivered quietly, in answer to a question the dealer asked as a matter of routine. The kind of lie that feels in the moment like the path of least resistance through a conversation that a man simply wants to get through as quickly as possible. The dealer's name was Frank Mead. He had run that dealership for 19 years. He asked Harlan, as he asked everyone who came in looking for a specific machine, what he intended to use it for. He asked this not to be intrusive, but because the answer informed the conversation, which configuration, which spec level, which optional equipment made sense, whether the machine being considered was actually suited to the application. Harlan said he needed it for row crop work. Secondary tractor, he said. Cover the overflow during planting and fall tillage when his primary unit was committed elsewhere. Frank said that made sense for what Harlan was describing. He pulled up the inventory, walked Harlan through two options that fit the stated application, and spent 40 minutes on a sale that concluded without incident. Harlan financed a Massey Ferguson 6S 155, shook Frank Mead's hand, and arranged for delivery the following Thursday. He drove home on a road he had driven thousands of times, and he sat in his truck in his own driveway for a few minutes before going inside, the way a man sits when he has just done something he is not entirely sure about and needs a moment before he has to talk to anyone. The truth about what he needed the Massey Ferguson for was not row crop work. It was not secondary field work or planting overflow or fall tillage. The truth was something Frank Mead would not have understood, and that Harlan was not prepared to explain to a man he knew professionally but not personally, in a showroom on a Tuesday afternoon with the service bay clanking in the background. The truth would come out at harvest. It always does, eventually. The seasons are honest in a way that men sometimes are not, and the harvest does not permit the maintenance of useful fictions. Harlan Cross had a daughter named June, who was 26 years old, and had, in the previous autumn, made a decision that Harlan had spent the winter processing in the specific, private way that fathers process decisions their children make that they did not expect and cannot reverse. June had come back to the farm, not temporarily, not for a season to figure out her next step. She had come back with the stated and apparently genuine intention of farming, of taking over an active role in the operation that Harlan had built across 23 years, with the long-term goal of eventually running it herself when Harlan was ready to step back. She had a degree in agricultural business from a state university, 2 years of experience working for a farm management company in another part of the state, and a level of practical knowledge that surprised Harlan when he actually tested it, which he had done carefully and somewhat covertly over the first weeks of her return. She was capable. Harlan had not doubted this abstractly, but seeing it in practice was different from assuming it. And what he saw in practice over the winter months, the way she read the soil reports, the questions she asked about his input contracts, the specific and informed opinions she had about his rotation, confirmed something he had been cautiously optimistic about without quite letting himself believe. The problem was not June's capability. The problem was the operation's infrastructure, and specifically its equipment, which had been built around one person's physical presence and availability rather than around the requirements of an operation that was now, functionally, trying to be run by two people on a more demanding schedule. Harlan's primary tractor was his. in the practical sense that a farmer's primary machine is his, calibrated to his preferences, operated according to his habits, the seat and the controls and the display configuration, all set to the way Harlan Cross ran a tractor after 23 years of doing it the same way. June could run it. She had run it. But running someone else's primary machine, adjusted to someone else's preferences, on someone else's schedule, is a specific kind of inefficiency that accumulates across a season into something more than minor inconvenience. What June needed for the operation to function as two people rather than one and a half was her own machine. Something she could set up her way, learn thoroughly, maintain according to her own standards, and operate without the ongoing friction of working around another person's configurations. Harlan had understood this through the winter. He had also understood, without quite articulating it to himself until he was driving to Frank Mead's dealership on a Tuesday in March, that buying his daughter a tractor was something he did not know how to say out loud in a county where people watched and noticed and drew conclusions, and that saying it to Frank Mead specifically, a man who would mention it at the co-op or the grain elevator or the feed store in the ordinary course of conversation, not out of malice but out of the simple fact that small county business travels, was not something he was ready to manage. So he said secondary tractor. He said planting overflow. He said fall tillage. He said things that were true in the narrow sense, that the machine would indeed be used for those things, without saying the thing that was actually true, which was that he was buying his daughter her first tractor and did not want the county to know before she had a chance to prove herself in it. The Massey Ferguson 6S.155 was delivered on a Thursday morning as arranged. Frank Mead's transport driver brought it on a flatbed and offloaded it in Harlan's equipment yard with the standard delivery procedure: walkthrough of the cab systems, confirmation of the service schedule, documentation for the financing. The driver, a young man who had been doing deliveries for the dealership for 2 years, did the job thoroughly and professionally and left without particular comment. June was not present for the delivery. Harlan had timed this deliberately, which required a level of coordination that he slightly resented having to manage, but managed anyway. June was in town handling a seed order that Harlan had asked her to deal with, an errand that was genuine, but that Harlan had specifically saved for that morning. He wanted to see the machine first, alone, before she did. He stood in the equipment yard after the transport drove away and looked at the 6S155 for a few minutes. It was a capable machine in a configuration that would serve the application well. Not oversized, not undersized, the right spec level for what a second operator on a 760-acre mixed operation actually needed. Frank Mead, working from the information Harlan had given him, had landed in essentially the right place, which was a reminder that a good dealer can often navigate toward the correct outcome, even when the stated application is not the complete picture, because the underlying operational requirements are legible to someone who has been selling into them for 19 years. June came home at noon. She drove into the yard, saw the machine, and stopped her truck. She got out and looked at it, and then looked at Harlan, who was leaning against the fence, with the expression of a man who has done something he is not going to explain in detail. She asked what it was for. Harlan said it was hers. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked what the catch was. Harlan said there was no catch. He said she was going to need her own equipment if the arrangement was going to work the way both of them apparently wanted it to work, and that the time to get her set up was before planting rather than during it. June walked around the machine once. She checked the things a farmer checks when looking at a machine for the first time. Not a buying inspection, since the buying was already done, but the orientation inspection of someone beginning to understand what they are now responsible for. She opened the cab, adjusted the seat, looked at the display configuration. She asked Harlan if he had told Frank Mead it was for her. Harlan said he had told Frank it was for secondary row crop work. June looked at him for a moment. Then she said she understood why he had done it that way, and that she did not entirely agree with the reasoning, but that she understood it. Harlan said he had not wanted the county paying attention to her situation before she had a chance to establish herself in it. June said the county was going to pay attention regardless. Harlan said he knew. He said he had wanted to buy her a few months before it did. Planting season began in the second week of April, and the truth started emerging, in the quiet and incremental way that truths emerge in agricultural communities, almost immediately. Frank Mead drove past the farm on the county road on a Friday afternoon in late April while making a delivery to an operation further east, and saw the 6S-155 working in Harlan's north field with an operator he recognized immediately. June Cross was 26 years old and had grown up in that county, and Frank had known her since she was 8 years old. Frank slowed his truck for a moment. He looked at the machine, looked at the operator, and understood exactly what the secondary row crop work application had actually meant. He drove on. He did not call Harlan. He did not mention it at the co-op that week, or the week after, or at any point through the remainder of planting season. Frank Mead had been selling equipment in that county for 19 years, and he understood the difference between information that was his to share and information that was not. June ran the 6S-155 through planting season with a competence that was visible to anyone paying attention, and in a county of 760-acre operations on close roads and shared co-ops and regular intersections at the grain elevator, most people were paying attention without actively trying to. She had configured the machine her way within the first week. Display layout, hydraulic response settings, the precision agriculture calibration for the planting equipment she was running. Harlan watched with the interest of a man observing someone figure out something he already knows, waiting to see whether the other person arrives at the same place. June arrived at most of the same places, and at a few different ones that were, on examination, at least as defensible as Harlan's preferences. The planting finished on schedule. The operation had performed the same as it would have with one person while distributing the physical demand across two, a different kind of improvement whose value shows up over a full season rather than in any single event. The harvest was where the truth came out in the way that harvests reveal things, not dramatically, not in a single moment, but in the accumulated visibility of a machine and an operator working a county's fields across the weeks that the season requires. June ran the Massey Ferguson through the early harvest work with a steadiness that Don Sellers, making his postseason rounds of client operations, described to Harlan in terms that were specific and professional rather than complimentary in any empty sense. He said she was reading the field conditions correctly and adjusting her operation accordingly, which was a more substantive observation than it might sound to someone who had not watched an inexperienced operator fail to do exactly that. The combine work, the primary harvest operation, was Harlan's, as it had always been, on a machine he had run for years and knew completely. But the ancillary harvest work, the grain cart operation, and the secondary field preparation that runs alongside the combining and requires its own judgment and timing, was June's, and the coordination between the two of them across the harvest weeks established a rhythm that Harlan recognized, with the private satisfaction of a man who has taken a significant risk and watched it resolve correctly, as functional. The county watched. Of course it did. A new operator on a new machine running through a visible harvest is not invisible in a county of people who track each other's operations out of the mixture of professional interest and social attention that characterizes tight agricultural communities. The conversations at the co-op and the elevator during the harvest weeks included, without exception, some reference to what was happening at the Harlan Cross place. Most of those conversations were neutral in the way that factual reporting is neutral, noting what was observed, speculating on what it meant, reaching the reasonable and largely accurate conclusion that Harlan Cross was transitioning his operation toward some kind of succession arrangement involving his daughter. A few of the conversations were warmer than neutral, reflecting the specific sentiment that communities develop toward families that are clearly trying to keep something alive across generations in an era when that effort is more difficult than it used to be. Frank Mead heard some version of these conversations through the ordinary channels of a dealer who is embedded in the community he serves. He updated his understanding of the situation without revising his behavior, which is to say, he continued not mentioning it to Harlan and continued treating the 6S155 account as exactly what he had originally understood it to be, which was equipment serving a farm that was trying to function well. Harlan stopped by the dealership in November after the harvest was finished and the equipment was put away and the season was complete enough to take stock of. He came in on a Tuesday afternoon, the same day of the week he had come in the previous March, and found Frank in his office reviewing service scheduling for the winter. Frank asked how the season had gone. Harlan said it had gone well. He said the 6S155 had performed exactly as he had needed it to. Frank said he was glad to hear it. He said the machine was a good fit for the application. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had not been entirely straight with Frank in March about what the application was. Frank said he was aware of that. Harlan said he understood Frank had probably figured it out. Frank said he had driven past the North Field in late April and had a pretty clear picture of the situation from that point forward. Harlan asked why he had not said anything. Frank said that what a man buys equipment for is his business, and that 19 years in that county had taught him that there was a difference between information that was relevant to the transaction and information that was relevant to the community, and that the second category was not his to manage on behalf of his customers. He said Harlan had bought a machine that fit his operation and had paid for it on a reasonable financing structure and had run it appropriately through a full season, and that the reason for the purchase was between Harlan and his family and not something Frank needed to have been told accurately in order to do his job. Harlan said he appreciated that. Frank said there was one thing he wanted to mention, which was that if June was going to be a long-term operator of that machine, she should come in and go through the service orientation directly with his shop manager, rather than working off the owner's manual and whatever Harlan had passed along. He said there were things his shop manager could show her about that specific machine's maintenance patterns that would extend its service life and reduce the likelihood of unplanned downtime, and that the orientation was complimentary and worth doing before the second season rather than after. Harlan said he would send her in. Frank said to call ahead so the shop manager could set aside the time to do it properly. They talked for a few more minutes about the season, about the county's overall crop performance, about the input cost projections for the following year. When Harlan stood to leave, Frank walked him to the door the way he walked every customer to the door, and as Harlan was crossing the parking lot, Frank said, without particular emphasis, that June had done well from what he had heard. Harlan stopped for a moment. Then he said she had. Frank said that was what mattered. June Cross went to the dealership in December for the service orientation Frank had suggested. She spent 2 hours with Frank's shop manager, a meticulous man named Gary who had been maintaining Massey Ferguson equipment for 27 years, and who conducted the orientation with the thoroughness that a man applies to things he genuinely believes are worth doing carefully. He walked her through the machine's service schedule, the specific points of attention that the 6S series required at various hour intervals, the early indicators of developing issues that were easier and cheaper to address before they became apparent faults. June asked questions throughout. Gary answered them with the directness that experienced mechanics apply to people they assess as worth answering directly, which is a form of professional respect that is not automatically extended and that June had apparently earned within the first 20 minutes of the session. When she left, Gary mentioned to Frank that Harlan Cross's daughter knew what she was doing. He said it the way mechanics say things they mean specifically, without elaboration, without the qualifications that soften a statement into something less than what it was. Frank said he had heard the same thing from several people through the season. Gary said the equipment would be in good hands. The Massey Ferguson 6S.155 is in its 4th season on the Harlan Cross operation. June runs it as her primary machine now, having taken on a more central operational role across the 3 years since the first harvest, and the configuration she established in that initial spring has been refined into a setup that is entirely her own, with nothing remaining of the factory defaults except what she chose to keep on its merits. Harlan's primary tractor still has his configurations, his seat adjustment, his display layout, his hydraulic preferences accumulated across 23 years of doing the same work the same way. But the operation itself is no longer built around one person's presence and availability. It is built around two, which is a different kind of structure, and one that is, as Harlan understands it now through the evidence of 3 seasons, more resilient and more capable than what he had before, even though it required admitting something he was not initially prepared to admit in a showroom on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The lie he told Frank Mead was a small one, directed not at the transaction, but at the community the transaction would eventually make visible. He had not wanted the county's attention on June before she had earned the right to receive it on her own terms. He had wanted to buy her the beginning of something without turning the buying of it into the kind of event that generates opinions before there is any evidence to base them on. Frank Mead had understood this without being told. He had understood it the way good dealers understand the things their customers cannot quite say directly, by listening to what is said and knowing from 19 years of practice what lies underneath it. The harvest had told the truth, as harvests do. The truth was simpler and less interesting than a lie of any substance deserved to be. A farmer had bought his daughter a tractor because she was going to need one. She had used it well. The operation was better for it. That was the whole story, available to anyone in the county who had been paying attention through a single growing season on the roads and at the elevator and in the fields visible from the county road. Harlan had wanted to tell it on his own terms. He had managed, through a small and useful lie, and a dealer who had known when not to ask questions, to do exactly that.